Welcome to the fourth in our series of Wisdom of Our Crowd interviews for the Sunday Breakfast Club. I'm Chris Satula, and I'm here today with Geoff DiMasi, tech entrepreneur and social entrepreneur who's been doing interesting things in Philadelphia. To embarrass Geoff right from the start, I always try to describe what he is our modern day Ben Franklin, a man who does a whole lot of things in a lot of different fields, always aiming at the public good as well as private benefit. Welcome, Geoff.
Thank you. You did do a good job of embarrassing me. So.
Always my goal, always my goal. So there's a lot of things I wanted to talk to you about because you've had a long career in Philadelphia of growing a business in a field where Philadelphia needs more people working in digital and tech, and also doing a whole lot of things for the public good. But first, tell us a little bit about the two companies that you run.
Sure. I'll start with Punk Ave Design Studio, socially minded, values-driven design studio. We've officially started, about 15 years ago, 2005. From the beginning, always wanted to work on projects that we felt were meaningful. It was, not just design, we'll do any sort of design branding websites for anyone. It was always about, finding the kinds of, the way we could use our skills to make an impact. And that kind of definition has evolved over the years. And we've, quite honestly tried to figure out what that would mean at different times. And when we first started talking about, what I would call like not just for profit type approaches, it was maybe less commonly talked about. And now I think there's a lot more conversation about that and different forms of that. And so I think we've evolved and adapted over the years. And then there's Apostrophe, which actually is an open source content management system that spun out of Punk Ave. It was built, for clients, solving client problems at the time. And then we spun it out as a separate company back in 2019. And it's evolved into what we call a B2B website builder platform.
And at various of my stops, I've had the opportunity to build two websites with Punk Avenue and work with your team. So I've sort of got a sense from the inside of how you try to form and run a team. But could you talk a little bit about your leadership style with the company and what you're hoping people who work at Punk get out of working at Punk?
Yeah, that's a good. That's a good question. I do feel like that's the kind of thing that evolves over time too. But one thing that maybe one overriding theme for me over the years has been my background. Also includes a decade-long stint as a professor at the University of the Arts, and I think in many ways I have thought about an experience working at Punk Ave as almost like a graduate school kind of experience, and that I hopefully in good ways. Maybe some people have bad graduate school experiences, but I think one thing that we do that's very important to me is that everybody has a voice, and so for instance, in some organizations, the junior members of the team never speak to the customer, to the client, whatever that might be, depending on the industry, but for us, it's always been about people, personal development and people having a voice in how the company is run and having a say in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's overwhelming because there's so many different opinions on how things should be run, but also having a voice in terms of representing the company. So, presenting their own work, for instance, is a thing that is very important to me. So, everyone develops those skills. I didn't actually even know, it's funny because I didn't even know, I think because I was a professor and I would always be working on the individual student and like having the individual present their work. And I didn't even realize, honestly, until years later that some people don't do that. So maybe it was kind of like just the path I took, and that it seemed obvious to me.
Did you have clients wondering or suspicious that if you weren't there making the presentation, they were getting the B team somehow? I mean, I worked with your folks long enough to sort of know what to expect and how you worked, but I imagine some customers could be a little taken aback when a 22-year-old is presenting.
I guess so. I never even, like I said, I didn't even think about that in that context, but some people are, and I think some people, you know, uh, maybe felt like that was shortchanging them or something like that. But usually, many times I would be there, and I would just be listening and taking in the presentation myself and adding to things if as necessary. But for the most part, I feel like it became clear that the person closest to the work with the most detail was presenting it, for instance, or could in the vast majority of the time. And sometimes people didn't have their best day or didn't do as good a job as somebody with maybe more experience, or things can happen. But I think overall it generally was understood by people that the approach was leading to good work and good outcomes. And I think like it also applied to, I will say it also applied to the way in which we engaged with, or the way we do engage with clients themselves. So we try to create an environment where everybody has a voice too on all the sides. So there's a lot of time taken to listening to the people we're working with, and and I mean not the people on my team, but the people that have hired us. And that sometimes can be met with concern, like it's going to slow the project down. How are we going to make a decision? I don't believe in consensus. But I think that I'm a big believer in a I don't know, in a structured form of consensus. And what I mean by that is consensus also, it just requires responsibility on everyone's part. So in a consensus environment, in my opinion, it is about giving everyone a voice, taking that time, so that when you get to the point where you're making a decision, there is a smaller group typically of decision makers. That's not you're not sitting around for everyone to get on board, but I think there's a different kind of buy-in when people have had that chance. And in consensus, it's not about stopping something from going forward. You also have the option to say, like, I disagree maybe with the situation, but I recognize that I've had my input and I'm not going to slow this down. And I think that's the spirit that I want to cultivate too on the people that, by giving them a chance to, have their voice heard through the process. So the process of working with a client and those kinds of principles that are really important to me apply, both internally and externally, like if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, as you know, what I do for a living now is conduct civic dialogues. And
Right.
what you're saying is reminding me of, sort of one of the mottos for our work, which we steal from Michael Sandel, the political philosopher, who said, together we can come to find a wisdom we could not find alone.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, the discovery process you have clients go through, I'm sure enables people to come up with ideas or understand what it is they thought they were trying to do that they couldn't have if it was all being done by email or if it was just the boss. And I know, having gone through your
Mhm.
team's discovery process twice with projects I was leading, I figured out far more precisely what it was we were hoping to achieve through those conversations than I could ever done, writing things down on a sheet of paper. The two other things that it did for me, let alone what it did for other members of the team, was I found out what parts of what we were thinking about doing were either confusing to them or generating resistance, the old pebble in the shoe. I also found out what the introverted members of the team actually could contribute,
Yeah.
because I've personally discovered over and over again that my personality is such that sometimes it is intimidating to the introvert. So, your team creating an environment where I was required to shut up and listen was extremely fruitful.
Yeah.
But they also got to hear me think out loud and more expansively about what I was hoping we could achieve through this digital project we were doing.
Yeah.
So part of it's just creating a space where that
Yeah.
kind of learning can take place.
Yeah, I love hearing what you're saying. I love hearing that, and it's reminding me of some of the things that are important to me in any sort of process, any sort of group process. Um, going back to being, a teacher, I know that people learn and think differently, and I think that's one of the things that I've talked about and try and learned from in terms of how I try to work with people and groups of people, and definitely in terms of, say, the punk app process. Not to be trying to oversell it or something, but I think that it does, you know, there's different ways in which people shine. And I think, like for instance, you doing one-on-one interviews, which I've done many of, in the context of a website or a brand project or something, you hear so many interesting things, and then being able to pull those together and sort of find some things that are both that, commonalities, and also things that are like outliers. Like, this is a really interesting thing that only one person said, but like, how do you all respond to this? It, it, it is, it does bring out things you never would have thought of. And also, you know, I live and die by that same process for everything I do. Like, I really believe in it for my own ways. I know that I need, and I've come to learn this too, like, I need to talk out certain ideas, like, with people, like that I come to better, but that's like the way I think. And, but it's also valuable for me to sit and write, or it's valuable, it's also valuable to hear other people's perspectives. And so creating an environment where everyone is sort of, I don't know, it's almost like theater in a way. Everyone's kind of accepting the same rules, or like improv. You're like, okay, well, here's the rules by which we're going to now talk. And then hopefully it reduces, the sort of what the word I'm looking for, but hierarchy in the room.
Yeah.
And kind of tries to create more of those kinds of spaces. And even if like you feel uncomfortable in the room, your voice maybe is coming through in some quotes that you said in a private one-on-one conversation. So that is really definitely a big part of, I'm always amazed, honestly. One thing I will say is, like, I think, I don't mean to be super critical, but I get in, as a citizen, I get in, I'm engaged in different, projects where, they say, we want community input. And one of the things that I'm always amazed by is, like, oftentimes that just means like one public meeting where you can maybe stand up and say something like, that's
Yeah,
that's community engagement. And I know that you do different kinds of work with that, but the vast majority, and I'll even talk to politicians and people who work in different government. I'm not saying, and they'll say like, yeah, but we don't want to really have like, we don't want to slow the project down. They'll use that idea that we don't want to slow the project down, so we won't do anything more than that. And I think it's misguided.
Yeah, that drives me crazy. I mean, there's a lot of, and there's been a ton of in Philadelphia in recent years, what we call check the box engagement.
Yeah.
We're going to put out a press release. We're going to set out a bunch of chairs, maybe buy some coffees and cookies. And we are going to provide a mic, and we will sit there and grimly endure whatever the people step up to the mic say. But there's no structure, there's no process, and there's no intent to get meaningful input that could be converted, distilled into useful guidance for a leader. And one thing and we sort of learned this in the, at the Penn Project for Civic Engagement that I help lead, that there are certain projects you just turn down. You finally get a sense that they're just doing this because there's some law or there's some grant that says they have to. And they've just decided, what they're going to do already. And they're just doing this so they can do what they decided already. Or they think of civic engagement as, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a meeting to sell people on it.
Right, exactly.
They're always amazed when there's pushback and resistance and lawsuits and people lying down in front of bulldozers and all that kind of stuff. Because, the time to do meaningful civic engagement is before you've decided what you're going to do, not after. But
I agree. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I will say too is, like, there are sometimes, I think, I don't know, like, the intent is to sell the project, and that's just not a good, that's not a good situation. But I think there are other times when I think people are genuinely just don't understand what is possible with engagement. And I think, it's like the Leslie Knope Parks and Rec style of just like having crazy people at the microphone if that is the thing you have planned, you are going to dread that night, and you are going to dread that engagement, whatever it is. But if you, I love it. I love days where it's, it's some of my most favorite days is like, great, there's going to be a workshop today. Like, I can't wait. I can't wait to hear everyone's opinion. I can't wait. So how do you go from like Leslie Knope, style, everyone yelling at you, to being excited about it? And I think like that's something that people just might be, I feel like just not informed about what's possible, at times. So.
Yeah, so not to get too far off the point, but we're at a moment when there's a lot of division in the country, and our president is saying, "Oh, let's listen and let's have dialogue and unity," which is a somewhat questionable goal in my mind. But and a lot of people are like, no, not with these people. I can't. I'm too upset. This has been too traumatic. But what that underlines for me is active listening, real listening is a skill. Which does not come naturally to most human beings. It's not innate. It has to be, in fact, most things about how we are as human beings run counter to that kind of listening. It's a skill. It needs to be learned. It needs to be taught. It needs to be practiced. And when you're talking about doing it at scale with a number of people, that is an expertise that very few people have. That's why so many corporate meetings are so either soul deadening or destructive.
Yeah.
I want to move on to sort of your efforts, the initiatives you've done as a social entrepreneur in Philadelphia. The civic engagement scholar Rich Harwood talks about third places. That a community, there's workplaces and there are fully public places. But what really needs to happen for a community to knit itself together is for it to have a rich variety of third places. I mean, in some cases it's the barber shop, or it might be the local diner, but it's places where you can come together and bump into folks and actually have meaningful conversation. And there are at least three things I know you've done that I'm very familiar with that I wanted to be sure we talked about. Independence Hall, Ignite Philly, and the Junto. So start with whichever one of those you want to start with, but sort of tell us about some of the work you've done with those initiatives.
I mean, they're somewhat interconnected, but I guess I could start just by I'll just start with the Junto. The Junto is something we revived in the spirit of Ben Franklin, who got together different business people, and they were all sort of up and coming, like younger business people, typically in Philadelphia. Many of us know this story, to share from my understanding, share knowledge, help each other, share books, and also kind of talk about ethics and sort of I don't know, the kind of ethical component of business. And that led to, one, helping each other in business, but also two, starting to engage in civic projects like street lighting or lending library, and people can connect the dots back to the first lending library in Philadelphia, to the Gento, or but a big part of it was they would bring up topics like wouldn't it be great if we did that? So we revived that in several years ago in Philadelphia, and we tried to figure out what that would mean in a modern day version of getting people together. And we would often meet at the studio at Punk Ave in the early times, and we just met monthly on different topics and that kind of thing. And one of the things that happened too was that around that time I met Alex Hillman, who had an idea for Indy Hall, which was a co-working space. And at the time, it's kind of funny to think about it in terms of history, but definitely the first co-working space of its type east of California. Like there was two in California that I'm aware of. And what I mean is, there was shared workspaces like as old as like humans, maybe, I don't know, but a sort of values driven, very specific and intentional co-working movement that, people now understand today didn't exist. And, we were getting people together, and I met Alex, and we had a shared interest in getting people together and providing spaces, a space for people to not just a physical space, but providing a place, a way in which people would get together. And that originally started in coffee shops and bars and people's houses and whatever. So it's, and guess what? That's where we're back to today. We're figuring out community in people's houses. While people are separate in their houses, Indy Hall continues. We haven't been in this space since March. So it's been being reinvented. We're sort of like back to our roots, but it's in some ways not a different challenge, right, than when we originally set out, or not a different belief or set of like, this is what we think should happen. People can benefit from knowing each other. People can do better things. I think one of the things that's always been very important to me is like, people can do more if they have trust in each other. So building trust and building relationships. And, I think that's really, a connecting dot. And then Ignite Philly, I should say too, I co-founded the Passing Square Civic Association before any of these things. And that also was about, in South Philly, building relationships between neighbors to be able to solve problems. And I think that has always been really important to me, and finding ways to connect with your neighbors. I'm definitely either somebody you hate or love as a neighbor, because I will chat with you. So I guess it depends on your temperament. But anyway, so Ignite Philly also, it was an interesting thing. There was the Hacktory was getting started, and it didn't have a space. And the people who were doing it, we reached out to and said, hey, is there any way we can help? We were in this, anything we can do together. And actually, they said, hey, there's this thing that's just started up in Seattle called Ignite Seattle. Why don't we do Ignite Philly? And so at that time we said, let's do it. And we did it. And I thought it was just gonna be a one-time event, having people talk about cool things that are happening in Philadelphia, things they're doing, but it's still going today. Now this is like, I don't know.
Take a moment to explain the exact terrifying structure of an Ignite Philly talk.
Yeah, so the idea being that the very tight structure, I enjoy this kind of thing too. So it's 5 minutes and you have 20 slides, and the slides change automatically every 15 seconds, right? Is that the number? Anyway. Oh
yes, it's very definitely 15 seconds.
So the slides change automatically and your talk is 5 minutes. So, you have to kind of do that. And I've, as a professor, I always love this, giving assignments like that. Okay, this is the constraints. This are the boundaries by which you're going to then, do something in. Make a film that's 5 minutes, or, whatever it might be. So that, is at a bar. It's at Johnny Brenda's. And, it's on a stage. So it's kind of fun in that way that we really get to use the stage where, typically like musicians are performing, and in a very intimate environment of about 300 people. But in that kind of, spirited environment where people are chatting and talking and drinking and having fun and socializing, and then people are passionately talking about something and there can be kind of some fun with how the slides are pushing them along. And I have honestly seen some people who I've seen speak in other contexts, and it's not that interesting, but when they give their Ignite Philly talk, it's, it is to the point. They get right to the point, and that can be really, really great. And that has been, we've seen some really poetical, beautiful, lyrical, metaphorical talks, but we've also seen very passionate talks about like, this is why we need to change X in Philadelphia, or this is something you should support or get involved with. And then we've seen activities come from that. Like, the first, I forget what his title, but Chris Alfano at Science Leadership Academy heard Chris Lehman speak and went and said, hey, I can help you with technology, and started working for him and helped create like infrastructure there. And, that was from Ignite Philly too. And, it's been interesting and exciting to bring people together for a period of time from different backgrounds, because it's not just tech. Like, we will have people talk about social causes to government things to whatever. And so we're getting people in the room. This is what I always love. I think it's a very diverse room. People in the room that wouldn't normally be in the same room together, and hearing from different components. And that's my favorite. That's probably one of my favorite things. And probably, normally we haven't done it in COVID, but normally it's like my 2 favorite nights of the year, up there with like
It's a Watsy. Jeff has heard me say this before, but for those of you out there watching, I've done it twice, and I will say the first time I did Ignite Philly, when I've done a couple of college commencements addresses, I've done theater, stand up, story slams. That was without doubt the single most terrifying experience of my life. But boy, did it feel good when it was over.
Yeah, it's
No, I was only about 5 seconds behind the slides. I mean, I've seen people, one thing we should acknowledge is it is at Johnny Brenda's, and people are not restrained in their sampling of the product there. And I've seen a few of your Ignite Philly speakers who perhaps should have laid off that third beer before they went out there.
it can happen. But there's also what's fun is to watch the crowd get involved, and people are cheering people along and encouraging them, and it's just the kind of thing that can only happen. And talking about it in the context of COVID right now, it's interesting, but it's one of the kinds of things that can only happen when you're responding to the energy of a crowd. Right. And one of the things I love about it is it's people talking about ideas, and then people getting excited about that in a bar. Like it's I guess about as close as you can get to colonial times.
I think if there's anybody who's ever down on Philadelphia or doubting Philadelphia, going to Ignite Philly makes you feel a heck of a lot better about the place where you live. And one time you read a tweet that apparently somebody had done right in the middle of somebody else's talk. You read it from the stage, and I've never forgotten it. If Portland and New York had a baby, it would be Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's a fun. Yeah, I remember reading that. Yeah, no, I think it's. I think it does capture the spirit of what I think of Philadelphia, and I think that's a fun way of thinking about it. There is an accessibility to Philadelphia, and to the kinds of, I think it's demonstrated on that stage because you could have a high-ranking government person on the stage right after somebody who had served time in jail and is now doing something around like recidivism or something. Like it goes, it's across. It's like this. It speaks to my experience of being a Philadelphian for sure.
Yeah, I stepped up there in my khaki pants the one time right after somebody who'd done a tribute to burlesque.
Yeah, so, there you go.
Going from the sublime to the ridiculous. But so, as you well know, as a board member of the club, our theme the past year has been recovery with equity. You've been trying to keep your businesses together and do things for your community in the midst of this pandemic. So what sort of thoughts have been running through your brain?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of, I do think a lot about like what it means to be, what you cut, what you keep in times of scarcity, in times of crisis. What are your like bedrock values, and how do you maintain them? And how do you manage the stress that the team is feeling, and all those kinds of things, and try to stay on course. It's been a weird time because some in terms of that, so what people are describing as a K recovery, some businesses have done incredibly well during this time, and I don't know what that could mean different things, and it could mean treating workers differently. And I know some companies have like changed their work from home policies, changed their way they think about their office, done mental health programs, done DEI programs with their teams, et cetera. So there's lots happening that can be very positive or transformative or can change the way people work. But there's also other businesses that are doing, struggling. There's a lot of people that are struggling. There's businesses that are just surviving and not doing either. There's just kind of riding in the middle of that K return. And I think it's also just, it can be an isolating time for people because not everyone's having, the same experience in this as we try to recover. And, I was even in just a group conversation with other business leaders that gets together periodically. And, this is no fault of the person who said this or led this, but they kind of kicked it off saying, yeah, everyone's, my understanding is like, since last time we met, now everyone's doing well and trying to hire and and just like it's just such a great time right now or something for our businesses. And I just thought, wow, I don't think everyone in this room feels that way, but that's an interesting assumption. And I did verify it afterwards that wasn't the case, right? And I think that's what, in the early time of when the quarantine first started, I think everybody was in the same boat. And it was an interesting time from that perspective, like March and April and May. And like, I think there was, and now I think we're starting to, and there's sort of ethical issues that are coming up that relate to like the vaccine and all these other kinds of things. So I don't, I think that it's a difficult time to sort of know everything. Like, I feel like everything is changing. I feel I've had conversations with Alex Hillman, my co-founder of Indy Hall, for instance, saying like, if we were to start Indy Hall today, we would do it completely differently. Mm-hmm. And you can say like, oh, well, isn't Indy Hall great in terms of this, that, or the other thing? Yes, but we would be thinking so differently in terms of equity, for instance, in terms of the diversity of who comes to Indy Hall. Like, that would be something we would think very differently about. So I think that I've also, like, quite honestly said, like, are the values that we are espousing like strong enough? Like, are we doing enough? Are we like, do we have the right to call ourselves like a principled business? Are we doing these things like in a deep enough way? I mean, I think I think they're legitimate questions that everyone can and should ask about sort of like, if they believe that business can be a force for good, if they believe that business has responsibilities that relate to both, staying in business, I guess, the business side of things, but also in the way in which you treat people and the way in which you're impacting the world, then I think this is a time to ask those questions and try to get answers. I think, personally speaking, I think you can, if you don't have endless resources, if you're not doing really, really well in this time, I think it's, it's very easy to say, okay, we're going to invest in X, Y, or Z if you have the money. But if you don't, what are you doing? And like, how do you help recover with, help our city and our country recover with equity, like that piece of it. And I think, and I feel like I said this when you asked me if I'd have this conversation, I don't feel like I have formulated all the answers or any of the answers yet, to be completely honest. And I feel like I'm very much in a listening kind of mode about that, and trying to decide where I fall and like what is legitimate and honest and authentic to what I think. Like, I don't want it just to be words that around those topics. And I don't want to just be, I hired a consultant. And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't hire a consultant, I don't know. But but I feel like that is something that has been, those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. Hopefully that wasn't too rambly, but.
That was good. One last question. We're sort of connects when it popped in my head when you said that about the K-shaped recovery. Mm-hmm. And, you've helped us on the club sort of struggle through some of these things, thinking about program and membership. Philadelphia is an interesting place in that there's a lot of sort of traditional structures from where the money used to come from. Mm-hmm. And then there is, we're not exactly Austin, but there is kind of a weird Philadelphia, and there's a lot of vibrancy there. Mm-hmm. But there also doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interaction or knowledge. There's a whole bunch of people who've been in Philly a long time and love it, who have never met the crowd that shows up at Johnny Brenda's, for example, for Ignite Philly. So have you ever, and as someone who, by age and the way I look and where I come from, actually doesn't in any way, shape, or form belong to weird Philadelphia, but, partly because of you, but headed out a little bit. Do you have any thoughts about how that gap could be bridged? It's not as important as gap as the equity gaps you're talking about, but there's a vibrancy in Philly that a lot of people who kind of feel that they're steering the ship of Philadelphia, don't seem to really know much about.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I mean, it's funny. The first thing that came to my mind was like, I thought you were going to ask about like how are you going to preserve that part of Philly, considering like how maybe like financially like um, vulnerable that part is. Theater, you know, like restaurants and the creative industry so associated around that, dance, performance, art, music, and the sort of like life that is possible in Philadelphia around those kinds of things, and then how that interacts. And yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Topic of our next meeting, but yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I think like, I don't know. I think there is like a real concern that for me that like that I don't know exactly how that will survive and what exactly will be happening around that. And in terms of crossover, I don't know. I mean, I think, I mean, if we're specifically talking about the Sunday Breakfast Club, that I've believed for a long time and advocated for, that if we're gonna that we can nominate leaders from different different parts of the city that may not meet what you may expect in terms of like a certain kind of profile of like revenue or different things like that. And I think we've done quite a bit to change some of that. And I think like, so, just personally speaking, I think it's like inviting people to different things that people are doing from different parts of the city, say specifically talking about Philadelphia. But I don't know, I think that a lot of this stuff is open to a lot of people if they choose. And I think creating specific ways in which people come together is like the best way that I know of. So like, for instance, Ignite Philly, inviting you as a speaker and then inviting the burlesque speaker, like sort of accomplishes that in my mind. But I mean, I think there's like, there's probably a lot. I mean, I guess I think I just do that on the sort of ant level of like just doing that. But I think there's opportunity, a lot more opportunity than people realize. I think people are very willing to go to engage in these different worlds. And that I've never had anyone really resist that I've invited or, and I think I feel lucky that I've been able to travel between many different communities and sort of worlds of Philadelphia. And I think it's more open and accessible than people realize at times. But then there might be things that are barriers that people don't even realize are there. So for instance, like the membership requirement of Sunday Breakfast Club was a barrier that I think we worked on as an example. And I think like those are the kinds of things that people, like obviously systemic issues that we could identify and work on that go beyond, bringing weird Philadelphia together with other parts of Philadelphia. So, it almost starts to go right down the path of like, recovering with equity around things like, systemic things that are keeping people out of opportunities and places.
Right. Thank you, Geoff. Great place to end. Thanks very much for sharing the time and the thoughts with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Chris.